Hello, I'm Zixiaofan from Columbia University, and today I'm going to talk about our work on charismatic speech. What makes a speaker charismatic, producing and perceiving charismatic speech? Charismatic speech has been used for centuries, but what is charisma? It's first defined by Max Weber as the ability to attract and retain followers by virtue of personal characteristics. It is often used to characterize the personal appeal of public figures, such as politicians or business leaders, but can also describe other non-celebrities. As for charismatic speech, it is a kind of speech that leads listeners to perceive the speaker as charismatic. Now we know the definition of charismatic speech, but why do we want to study it? First, speech is an essential modality of perceived charisma. So understanding charismatic speech is very important for understanding how people deliver charisma. Also, charismatic speech has a lot of applications in different areas. First, by using charismatic speech in virtual assistant, we can make a computer-generated voice more trustworthy. Also, if we understand the properties of charismatic speech, we can help people to improve their own speech production. Finally, knowing which public figures are more charismatic in speech, we might better explain social events. Previous studies on the perception of charismatic speech mostly focused on politicians and business leaders, but there are also some work on non-celebrities, such as university lecturers. However, in almost all the studies, the speakers being studied were male, and there's not much knowledge on how people perceive charismatic female speech. A few studies addressed the gender difference in charismatic speech, and they found that females are less charismatic than males. However, the results are not based on human perception, and the scoring metrics were taken from studies on male speech, which might be already biased. So here in our work, we present a gender-balanced study on the perception and production of charismatic speech. The speakers we used are mostly non-celebrities, so the rater's judgment on charisma won't be affected by the personal opinion towards the speakers themselves. Except for answering what is charismatic speech, we are also interested in the question of do different people perceive charisma differently by collecting raters' demographic and personality information as well as samples of raters' own speech. Here's our data collection process. We collected speech from 30 male and 30 female speakers from YouTube and selected a 20-second clip for each speaker. Then we asked crowdsourced workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk to rate these clips, so that each clip was rated by 15 to 20 raters. We also collected demographic information from the raters, including gender, level of education, sexual orientation, and personality scores in Big Five dimensions. The raters were also asked to record two voice samples. One is their normal speech and another is charismatic speech. Studies have found that the nature of charisma is elusive, so to better model people's definition of charisma, we asked the raters to not only rate the voice clip on charisma, but also assign scores to other 17 traits that are positively or negatively associated with charisma. On the right of the slide shows an example when rating the 18 traits for one clip. The order of the clips and the traits, including charisma, were randomly shuffled every time. Here's the raters' information that we collected. We collected ratings from 97 English-speaking raters. 60 of them are female and 36 are male. 68 of the raters are heterosexual, 16 homosexual, and 11 bisexual. 42 of the raters are attracted to females and 65 attracted to males. For education, most of them had associate degrees or higher. For the raters' average scores on the Big Five personality dimensions, the distribution was skewed towards a higher score for the 4 personality dimensions except for extroversion. Given the voice clips, the ratings, and the raters' information we collected, we asked the following questions, and I'll go over them in the rest of this presentation. First, we want to know how our raters define charisma. by examining the correlation between charisma and other speaker traits. We found that liveliness, enthusiasm, persuasiveness, and confidence were most positively correlated with charisma, and boringness, introversion, weakness, uncertainty, and ordinariness were most negatively correlated with charisma. The correlations are consistent across both speaker genders and both rater genders, indicating that people have a similar definition of charisma, regardless of gender. But for the perception of charisma, the inter-rater agreement is fairly low, indicating that different raters have their own ideas of which kind of speech is charismatic. For other speaker traits, we found that traits with a higher activation are more agreed upon, and lower activation traits are more open to interpretation. For the role of genre in charisma ratings, we found that interviews are less charismatic than educational lectures and talks, maybe because the goal of the speech is different. When the speakers are trying to get the point across in talks and lectures, they may seem more charismatic. For interviews, the goal is more for factual transfer, so the speaker may appear less charismatic. Next, we are interested in, do people rate females and males differently on the traits? Overall, female speakers were rated higher for charisma than male speakers, but the difference was not statistically significant. For the other traits, male speakers were rated as less sincere, less fluent, and less extroverted, but more boring and more introverted than females. A possible explanation is that most talks were from females, and talks were generally more charismatic. So the lower charisma score for males might be due to genre and not gender. Then the question is, what kind of speech is charismatic? To remove the inherent gender difference, we normalize the features using the mean values for American English speaker in each gender. We found that mean intensity, mean pitch, speaking rate, and standard deviation of pitch were positively correlated with charisma, meaning that charismatic speech is louder, higher, faster, and with greater fluctuation in pitch. To analyze the gender-specific properties of charismatic speech, we tested the speech features on male and female speakers separately. We found an interesting difference between genders, that ratings on female speakers were more based on intensity level, but ratings on male speakers were more based on pitch level and speech tempo. For the lexical properties of charismatic speech, we extracted word usage features using Luke software, and found that speakers using more questions had higher charisma ratings, while speakers who often refer to themselves and talk about their feelings, especially with negative emotion, received low ratings. In gender-specific tests, we found some difference between male and female. However, speakers that use negative emotional words were rated as less charismatic, regardless of gender. We also examined whether the raters' demographics and personality influenced their ratings. We found that male raters rated people as weaker and colder than female raters did. Specifically, when judging male speakers, male raters rated them as weaker and less fluent than female raters did. And when judging female speakers, male raters rated them as colder, more introverted, and less extroverted than female raters did. For education, we found that raters with higher education level rated speakers as less ordinary, less boring, less intelligent, and less fluent, but more eloquent and more lively. This just suggests that raters may use themselves as a reference. For personality, we found that for raters with higher scores in openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability, they tended to rate speakers higher in charisma and higher in traits that positively correlated with charisma. but lower in traits that negatively correlate with charisma, which means that raters may also project some of their own personalities in rating others. Finally, we examine raters' own recorded speech. When comparing each rater's charismatic and normal speech, we found that raters increased their mean intensity, mean pitch, and standard deviation of pitch, and decreased their harmonics to noise ratio when asked to be charismatic. Not surprisingly, this change in their own charismatic voice is similar to how they rate the speaker's charismatic voice. For gender-specific rater groups, we found that female raters only significantly increased their mean intensity, but male raters changed almost all acoustic features when asked to be charismatic. This indicates that raters do change their voice based on what they believe is more charismatic, but they also change other aspects of voice that they're less aware of when listening to others. When we compare the change of male and female raters, we found that male raters exaggerate their voice more than females when producing charismatic speech, and male raters who see themselves as more charismatic tend to exaggerate their charismatic speech even more. For future work, we plan to study multimodal charismatic speech to see how speakers' gesture and facial expression influence the perception of charismatic speech. We are also interested in cross-cultural perception of charismatic speech and charismatic speech in different domains. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me by email at zy2231@columbia.edu. Bye.